implementación de estas nuevas tecnologías.
Training to implement these new technologies. How important is it to train people to implement all these technologies?
The training question.
That's a very good question, and part of the answer is it's very important. In terms of if we really want the technologies to be useful, of course, we really need to make certain that the individuals with access to it fully understand how powerful it is and how to use it. Once again, the good news is the technology has become easier and easier to utilize just in its native form without a great deal of training. We were speaking earlier today about the web and what has happened to the web since the development of the browser. Prior to the browser, it was very difficult to navigate internet space. And today, the browser has made it as easy, as accessible, and really as friendly as working with our local Macintosh computer, for instance. So, training is important, but the ability to assimilate many of these technologies is becoming quite easy to do on one's own.
Mm-hmm. Actually, I think that the question should be addressed to our moderator here, Dr. Mike Reel. He's the one who understands education. But let me take one small part of the question. It is very important because, as I think I've already indicated in my earlier answers, I'm a great enthusiast for the democratization effect of the World Wide Web. I would like to encourage everybody, down to school children, to make it easy for them to create their own pages on the World Wide Web. Admittedly, such pages are not the most interesting thing you can find out there, but the sooner we can make our children familiar with this technology, the more they will use it as they grow, and therefore the richer the Internet and its sources of information will become as we all progress. And as Hal quite rightly says, the training problem is not a very difficult one. There is software now that makes creating a web page about the same problem as creating a word processing document.
And in my experience as an educator, there is a generational reversal that the young people are teaching the old people in many cases. We will offer courses on web page design, and then, for example, a student has designed my web page. I didn't make it. A young person did.
Right.
So if we give them a minimum of tools, there are people who will just run away with it and do things we can't imagine.
Yeah, it's a very attractive thing to do, and it's very rewarding. The first time that you create a web page, it's a very rewarding thing to think that, hypothetically, anybody in the world could come and visit your creation.
We have a question from Ecuador, from the Universidad Espíritu Santo in Guayaquil, Ecuador. Welcome. Your question, please.
La pregunta, ¿aló?
¿Aló?
Hello.
¿Aló? Yes.
¿Aló?
Sí, diga. La
Welcome.
pregunta. Bienvenido.
Buenos días. La pregunta
Good
es la
morning.
siguiente.
The question is the following.
¿Cuál será el futuro
What
de
is
las
the
tecnologías
future of
Fast Ethernet y ATM?
of the fast Ethernet technologies and the ATM technologies? What is the future of these technologies?
Excellent question. I want to repeat it and make sure I have it right. What is the future of ATM and fast Ethernet? Fast Ethernet has a bright future. Not long ago, we operated on local area networks in an Ethernet environment at 10 megabits, and we thought that was very good. Today, we're seeing the deployment of 100 megabit Ethernets. Soon, we will see gigabit Ethernets available to us, and Ethernet in the local area networking space will provide us the opportunity to share within closed environments a great deal of information very quickly. The faster our Ethernets go, the more information and the more types of information we can put on those Ethernets. For instance, video conferencing can now run in Ethernet space. ATM and Ethernet will work together in terms of the handoff from the local area network to the wide area network. And that's the real power of asynchronous transfer mode technology. It allows us to take a variety of differing payloads and types of payload with differing protocols and encapsulate them and move them from one local area network to another. And so it's a very bright future. It's truly the direction that we as a user community are driving the technology.
We go now to a question from Mexico, from Monterrey, from the Comisión Federal de Electricidad in Monterrey, Nuevo León. Welcome. Your question, please.
Monterrey, adelante.
Bueno,
Buenas.
mi pregunta es esta.
My
Hablo de
question is the
Monterrey, Nuevo
following.
León. ¿Cuál es el conductor más eficiente
What is the most efficient
para enviar voz,
conductor
dato y video?
to send
tipo de enlace?
voice and data, voice data and video data on this kind of, what's the best medium, what's the best?
Well, there's, again, as I said in my pre-recorded remarks, there are many ways to accomplish this. It depends a great deal on the nature of the communication and where the communication's going. For instance, if you need to engage in a video conference, for instance, between, say, San Diego and somewhere else around the world today and tomorrow elsewhere around the world, ISDN makes an excellent choice because of its what we call switchability, or the ability to make multiple connections to different places. Other types of technologies are better suited if, for instance, you're going to connect to the same place over and over again. We believe over time ATM will be the technology of choice for most mixed payload wide area connections. But each of the technologies that I discussed in the introductory or in my pre-recorded remarks have a place in this space.
Okay. Let us begin now with Module 2, in which Mr. Harris will tell us a bit about what to expect in the way of new developments on the Internet.
The nicest thing about being in the internet business is that there are no old hands. There's nobody around to say, oh, but we've always done it this way. Or even, these are the rules of the game. Nobody has always done things anyway, and the closest we ever get to rules is what we call frequently asked questions. I find this all very liberating, but don't worry, I feel free, but not so free as to make up facts. Today, I'm going to talk about the Internet as I really see it. Well, I'm the last person on earth to think a history lesson is the best way to begin a talk like this, but I would just like to remind you, since these days everybody seems to think that the Internet is the World Wide Web and vice versa, what an incredibly recent phenomenon the web actually is. The Internet, as such, was in existence for about 20 years before the protocol that runs the web was even thought of. And in those days we used other protocols such as file transfer, telnet, email, and so on. How many of you remember the gopher? This is how we used to search the net before the web was widely available. It's an almost endless series of menus in a system invented by librarians at the University of Minnesota in the late 80s. The gopher was pretty good, but not at all pictorial. There were pictures, by the way, but you had to download them without seeing them and then import them into a graphics editing program such as LView to view them. Can you imagine that? Now, here's a graphic which is essentially a snapshot of history, capturing the 2 years when the web first eroded, then equaled, and then finally swamped the gopher. This graphic cuts off in late '94 when gopher traffic was just beginning its decline, a decline that has accelerated while web traffic has soared way, way off this scale. Today, the web is delivering over 5 quadrillion bytes of information a month. That's about 1,000 times what you see here. And you probably don't need me to tell you the reasons for that outrageously successful takeover. The web has built-in graphics, multimedia, and above all, those incredible hyperlinks that allow you to follow your own path through the mass of content. In fact, the newer generation of graphical web browsers, such as Netscape, have replaced not only the Gopher, but almost every other internet protocol as well. The FTP, the email, the news groups, and so on. Before the web came along, the net was the stamping ground of scientists, engineers, and librarians. Oh, and mischievous students. I almost forgot that very influential subgroup. And when the Mosaic graphical web browser was released in 1992, suddenly it was as though the drawbridge came down and the mob stormed the internet castle. I personally remember very clearly attending a demonstration of Mosaic in the library of the University of California and coming away thinking that my life was about to change in some way. How right I was. Well, I'll be coming back to some of the compelling features of the web a bit later, but first I want to draw your attention to one of the few internet activities that has not been subsumed by the web. I'm talking about the immediate two-way conversation of internet chat, and specifically the protocol known as Internet Relay Chat, or IRC for short. Now, I'm something of a connoisseur of IRC, actually. It was the subject of the first book I ever wrote on an internet topic, and I still start most of my days by sitting down at my computer and talking to the world. Here's a sample of what IRC looks like. This is just one of about 1,200 channels that function day and night like a rolling cocktail party. Over there in the right-hand column of this window is a list of the nicknames of all the people attending this party. It's extremely easy to find out where they all come from, and if you know what you're doing, you can often find out a great deal more about them besides. Up in the title bar up top there is the supposed topic of the conversation, although admittedly that's seldom any indication of what's really being discussed, which is perhaps not very serious-minded. It's often trivia, gossip, flirting, and so on. This is, of course, a pre-captured session. I couldn't possibly risk demonstrating anything live because those conversations can sometimes be quite unsuitable for an educational forum like this. Well, as the world turns majestically on its axis, the population of IRC changes, depending upon which nation is awake at the time. Dominated in turn by Americans, then Australians and Japanese, then Malaysians, Israelis, Europeans, back to Americans, so on and on and on. National characteristics come through surprisingly well in this relatively primitive medium. And just in case you doubted it, I want to let you know that Latin Americans are plentiful on IRC, as they are on the net more generally. Here are some Mexicans chatting, for instance. Their national characteristic, of course, is to type very fast with as much emphasis as possible, and not always choosing the most delicate words. I've personally made friends with people from Chile and Brazil over these networks, as well as Mexicans, Israelis, Scandinavians, Dutchmen, Canadians, French, everywhere you can think of. Well, IRC is often belittled because the content of the conversations is often so trivial. But I believe it deserves to be taken a bit more seriously. First, because of the extreme fascination that this very immediate form of communication has for many people who are online. This rather titillating recent feature in the Los Angeles Times portrays online chat as a life-saving refuge for Americans driven out of the sex game by fear, and points out that the much publicized difficulties brought on by America Online's unlimited time offer to its customers last year were largely due to the fact that millions of people were chatting all night, freed not only from the fear of catching a sexually transmitted disease, but also now of the fear of overspending. In AOL terminology, a conversation takes place in a chat room, and as this article points out, there can be 15,000 of them on busy nights. Now, the point that I take from that is that the limitations of this form of communications are not as important as they might seem. I'd like to point out that IRC has always been unlimited time. In fact, it's utterly without cost once you have your basic access to the internet. To implement an IRC connection, you need to install client software that may be had for free from this web address. And then you need to find the address of a local server computer. There's a list of them in the notes accompanying this talk. Now I'd like to point out some features of IRC that make it very suitable for much more serious uses than flirting. Here, for example, you see a binary file being exchanged between two participants in an IRC conversation. The file transfer is extremely quick. It does not interrupt the conversation itself. The file might be a picture, a drawing, a fragment of speech, or music, anything. Now here's a special window opened up for a private side conversation between two participants in the main channel. Here's another window where the so-called channel modes can be set up. The channel modes include things like restrictions on who may participate, who's permanently excluded, and so on. To me, the utility of these features for business and education is absolutely obvious. And I predict the advent of super chat that will put these international channels to very serious purpose. Perhaps, but not necessarily, including video. One of the delightful features I find of keyboard interaction is that you don't get the usual social cues from people, their age, their appearance, their speaking accent, dress, and so on. This, I find at any rate, is quite liberating. And some scholars have actually made a living from studying this, the effect this has on communication. My company's already undertaken some trials in the implementation of Super Chat. We have experimented with simultaneous translation windows. We've actually produced Shakespeare using actors from all over the world, albeit with very minimal scripts. Just about 1 year ago, we got together 7 families in 7 different countries for a synchronous meal. Every family cooked exactly the same recipe, and we all sat down together at the same time. It was a very cheerful occasion. I think you can tell that I'm having a pretty good time here, but it did take a bit of organizing, I must admit.
When we got there, first, our English friends, Lee and Simon Harris, were already on the channel because they had miscalculated the time. They didn't realize there was a difference between Greenwich Mean Time and British Summer Time. So they were there. They've now gone, I think, to put a baby to bed. And we've been joined instead by 4 Dutch people and 1 from Canada.
Well, whatever the glitches we had to put up with that day, I can promise you the food was absolutely delicious. Now, I said a moment ago that video was not a necessary component of Super Chat, and I gave a sort of sociological reason for that. But as many of you know very well, there's also a technical reason. Television does not transmit very well over the internet. In fact, synchronous TV signals, like the one you're all watching right now, where you're hearing the same words as my lips are forming, don't really transmit at all because there's far too much information in them. The arithmetic that proves this is pretty simple. You can think of a TV picture as lots and lots of little dots called pixels. In the American system, there are 525 vertically by about 500 horizontally. That's about 262,000 little dots. Describing the color properly takes 3 bytes per pixel, so that's 790 kilobytes. Okay, now you have to deliver all that 30 times a second. That works out to nearly 24 million bytes per second, or roughly 190 million baud in the jargon of the computer network business. Meanwhile, 28.8 thousand baud is standard for transmission over phone lines. So now you know why the computer video of the mid-1990s is mostly small, silent, and black and white. It takes ages to download, and then it's gone in a flash.
Well, this problem is being tackled, and it's being tackled from what you might call both ends at once. First, the available speed of the net, or the bandwidth as it's known, somewhat inaccurately, is being improved. 56,000 baud modems are now available and affordable. And the new technologies which my colleague here has already described are now putting the enormous bandwidth of the TV signal within range. But perhaps more important, the software technologies of signal compression are achieving what was once thought to be impossible. What I mean by that is that very ingenious people are now finding out how much of the video and audio information can be thrown away without anybody noticing. And it turns out to be a great deal. Now, obviously, I'm talking about something a bit more subtle than simply chopping out a chunk of the picture, or even missing out every other scan line, since either of those techniques would be all too noticeable. Now, I'm talking about adaptations of technologies that were developed for compression of the information in still pictures. Some of these compression techniques can reduce the size of a picture file to 20% of its natural size with no loss of quality whatsoever, and to 5% if you're willing to accept some loss. Well, today's internet video compresses the picture information using those same techniques. And it also depends on one additional technology, that of streaming, what's called streaming. Here's the problem. Compression software can reduce the bandwidth of a TV signal from 24 megabytes a second to around 4 megabytes per minute at 15 frames per second instead of the normal 30. So that does make it a serious proposition for embedding in the web. But with a 28.8 modem, it would still take nominally 2 minutes or so to download a minute of information. So who's going to wait 2 minutes to find out if a 1 minute video clip is worth watching? What streaming offers is the ability to see the file as it's arriving. So you no longer have to wait for 4 million bytes to dump into your computer before you see anything. Streamed video waits only until there's enough of it down to provide a little leeway, and then off she goes. At the server end, a fairly sophisticated encoder costing up to $33,000 is required to perform this trick. However, the client-side software is, guess what, free. Well, free, that is, so long as you have a 46DX or Pentium chip and a 32-bit operating system. If you have, go grab the Real Player software from this address, and you've got yourself up-to-date web video. By the way, there's no truth to the rumor that Real Video is owned and operated by my friend Mike Reel. He probably wishes it was. Well, I'd just like to end this theme by making sure we all understand the difference between video on the web, which is what we've been talking about, and web TV. Web TV is something different. It's a proprietary format which brings the entire World Wide Web to your TV set instead of your computer. To make it work, you buy a little interpreter box with a slot for your credit card in it. When I first saw that, that was another of those moments when I thought, aha, I'm seeing the future. Only in this case, I wasn't too sure I liked what I saw. Web TV became a business story last month when Microsoft bought the company for $425 million. So, has the advent of streamed video opened the floodgates of poor quality TV onto the web? The answer is not yet. But I do want to move on from considering the techniques that are transforming the internet to some discussion of the content of the net, because that's what we're all there for. At least I certainly hope so. Nowadays, you don't need to go to the movies to see a preview of coming attractions. Hardly a major movie opens now without a place in what's being called Hollyweb. There are websites that enable people to follow their favorite TV shows. Just going back to technique for a second,
A++ to Fox for a really excellent pioneering website for their series The Simpsons, using the very latest in vector graphics, and at the same time C++ to the Fox attorneys who refused to allow their content to be reproduced, thus making it illegal for me to show it to you. You'd have loved it, believe me. Well, entertainment on the web, just like web TV, is a business story. At the same trade show at which the web TV buyout was announced, Sony, Paramount, NBC all announced major investment in internet entertainment. America Online isn't exactly the internet, but it did set an example for others to emulate when it hired Brandon Tartikoff to run an entertainment division for them. Tartikoff, for those of you who don't follow these things, is the ex-head of programming for NBC and an absolute legend in the entertainment business. Microsoft, a legend of a different kind, is investing nearly $10 billion in web entertainment, and that's just the part they're publicly announcing. Well, all of this interest is indication of a belief that the great convergence of home electronics is just around the corner. I'm talking about the anticipated moment when our computers, our TV sets, our radios, and our CD players all merge into one product. Personally, I'm hoping these things will mix a good margarita as well. Well, now for the downside, which turns out perhaps to be an upside depending upon your taste in entertainment. Several companies that got in too quick with online entertainment have either failed or laid off workers because the revenue just didn't come in. People, you see, are accustomed to finding information and software on the web for free, and they resent being asked to pay for it. This month, Microsoft will let the axe fall on 10 audience-hungry shows in what the Los Angeles Times reported as a first-round failure. Well, the good news is that the shows were all soap operas, like this one, 475 Madison Avenue. I'm sorry to say, however, that I cannot report the death of telenovelas on the web. Microsoft is going to be trying the format again later this year. My own company is fairly well placed to cash in on the trend to make computers and TV sets indistinguishable, since we're experienced in TV production as well as journalism, web publishing, and computer programming. In fact, these days, we're calling ourselves by a whole new name, online content providers. This is actually a great new opportunity for media types like us, and it arises because the high-tech companies tend to get grandiose ideas about online services. They spend a lot of money constructing them, and at the last minute they say, well, that's very nice, but now what do we actually want to use this for? Perhaps the prime example of that in our experience is America Online's Digital City, which subcontracts virtually all of its actual content. Here, for example, is my company's entertainment information site on the web, which we call Zoom San Diego. That's been running for nearly 3 years now. And since about this time last year, we've been supplying the exact same content to Digital City. When it comes out of their pipeline, it looks extremely different. But the difference is all on the surface. The same database runs both sites. When you put a new record in that database, it spits out 2 pages, one formatted for the web and the other for AOL. Not bad being paid twice for the same product, eh? Except we in fact don't actually make anything at all out of the website. But there is an opportunity for any of you out there who have general media experience. Develop a few programming skills, wait for some online service to open up in your city, and I can practically guarantee that history will repeat itself. They'll have the technology working great, but they'll be desperate for content. Well, my next theme is something I know absolutely nothing about: marketing. I know nothing, I mean, about the skills required to market products, design ad campaigns, persuade people that their cars or hairspray or garden furniture absolutely must be replaced because they're way out of date. Marketing in that sense. But I'm going to talk about it anyway because I have been known to enter a supermarket, particularly the food section. So I know about the consumer side of marketing, and this theme also continues our exploration of web content because, of course, there are hundreds of thousands of people out there who'd like to use the web to move product. I'm extremely suspicious of anybody who claims to be making a fortune on the web, and I'll give you some hard figures on that in a moment. But by golly, if they're not making much, it certainly isn't for want of trying. And what finally attracted my attention to all of those sales pitches I saw on the web was the solution to a rather tricky little data management problem. Now, here's a good example, the Land's End website. It offers a wide range of clothing, luggage, and so on, in a wide range of sizes and styles. I haven't counted, but my guess is that this site is several hundred pages, almost all of which have something to sell. So, here's the data problem. The protocol used by the web is what we call stateless, meaning that each transaction takes place in isolation, and the act of reading a fresh page inherits nothing whatsoever from what may have happened on previous pages. Now, you can't possibly put everything Land's End has to offer all on one page so that the shopper simply checks off boxes indicating a complete set of shopping decisions, then fills out his or her credit card number and shipping address, checks out once. No, in practice, there has to be a separate page for women's running shorts, another one for tote bags, and so on and on and on. So, how do you manage the site so as to keep track of purchases and check them all out at once, like in a supermarket? Well, I didn't pick Land's End at random because this site actually pioneered a data management system known appropriately enough as a shopping cart that does exactly that. When you make your first purchase at this site, a cart is allocated to you. It's actually a 20-digit number based on the system time combined with the user's address and manipulated a bit just to make sure it's unique. And what that is really is the name of a temporary data file written on the Land's End computer. And the first record in that file is the details of your first purchase. From then on, you can make further purchases, review the contents of your cart, maybe reconsider a previous purchase, stay as long as you like. When you're ready to check out, you add your shipping and payment details once only. The data in the cart is dumped out to a customer master file, and the cart itself is deleted. At the same time, a little routine looks around for any abandoned carts lying around, since you can't stop people from wandering off without completing the checkout procedure, and you certainly don't want rusty old carts cluttering up the site. I've written software like this personally. I can tell you it's not too hard. The tricky part is making sure the customers don't lose their carts or pick up someone else's by mistake. This Land's End site allocates up to 100 carts a second when they're very busy. And it's a tribute to them that the site rarely crashes. This programming was done by Burby Information Systems in Madison, Wisconsin. So there's one trend in web shopping that's making your life as a web shopper easier and more secure, although you wouldn't normally notice it or even think about the problem of managing serial decisions in stateless systems. Another trend is one that you're much more likely to notice. Some sites seem to know not